Hi, I'm Pamela Rucker, contributing editor for CIO.com. Cyber threats such as ransomware attacks represent an existential threat for businesses. IT leaders increasingly understand that strategic cyber resiliency planning delivers more than just peace of mind. It delivers business continuity, compliance, and consistent customer experience. During their average 4.6-year tenure, a CIO will experience over 1,200 cyber attacks. The exhaustive planning required to ensure holistic resilience against threats incurs substantial cost, both from an expense and a staffing perspective. And with increased regulatory scrutiny, organizations are tasked with finding a balance between compliance demands, along with managing and augmenting existing protections. In this discussion brought to you by Hitachi Vantara, we are going to hear from leaders in the field about what it is like to face an attack and how they think a holistic, closed-loop approach from preparing to recovering and back again should become part of enterprise strategy. For this discussion, I am joined by Tanisha Martin, the Executive Director and Chairwoman at Black Girls Hack. She is a speaker and a mentor who looks to create a safe space for Black girls in cybersecurity. Scott Schober is the President and CEO of BVS Systems and the best-selling author of Senior Cyber, Hacked Again, and Cybersecurity is Everybody's Business. And Kane McGladrey, Field CISO at Hyperproof, and Senior IEEE member and an enterprise thought leader. Hello, everyone. So let's get to some questions. Look, we know that cyber criminals can bring businesses to a standstill. We all know that. So with consequences that reach both far and wide, an interesting way to start this discussion might be to say, what is it really like to face an attack? So what do people initially do? How do they initially feel? Scott, I know that you have some experience with that.
Yeah, firsthand I experienced it. We're running a cyber security company. We make wireless threat detection tools. A number of years ago, we were targeted and hacked repeatedly. And we had a credit card, the debit card compromised, Twitter account was taken over, had repeated DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, so we couldn't have any online commerce. It was a mess for the business. And finally, we had $65,000 stolen out of our checking account. It was a mess, and it became a federal investigation with paperwork and letters and so on and so forth. And it took a lot of time to discover what happened, the mistakes that were made. And I learned a lot of it in the process. And when that all unfolded, it was kind of interesting because I got a phone call from Associated Press, and they said they were doing some feature stories on companies that were hacked and compromised. And I said, oh no, it's the last thing I want to do is go on the record talking about this. And I said, okay, I will acquiesce and I'll share my story as long as I could share the mistakes I made, but also the things I learned, so hopefully other business owners don't traverse down that same path that I've done. And they agreed and I agreed, and it worked out very well, and I felt good. It felt almost like a relief being transparent, coming clean and explaining, hey, we made some mistakes and here's what happened. But more importantly, here's what I learned from it so you don't make the same mistakes that I make. And I think that's a really important thing, a takeaway that I got from it. It led to me writing my first book, Hacked Again. Be transparent if you're a company and share your mistakes. That's important because you learn from your mistakes, and maybe even more important, other people can learn a lot from your mistakes.
Yeah, because I can imagine that all of us have this moment when you just shock and dismay when you're initially attacked, right? You feel fear, you feel shame, you feel embarrassment. And to your point, nobody wants to share any of that with everyone else. And Kane, I want to ask you, because when we see this happen, a lot of times people might take this personally. So do you ever feel like the pressure of this makes leaders worry about their own personal liability?
I think that it does. And I think that having your business be attacked is an emotionally jarring moment. And it is a real test of senior management and the board's commitment to managing effective cyber risk and effective business risk, which are functionally the same thing, where that response is going to be informed by the relationships everyone has, more so than the technology. It's going to direct the resources, it's going to direct public relations, it's going to direct internal communications to the employees. And having that early agreement of here's how we will handle this event, because it will happen. It's no longer we're no longer in a field of play where it's an if, it's a when. But also there are external regulatory pressures that are seeking to cause potential liability on officers where regulators have felt, look, we've told you 10 years ago, we told you 5 years ago, we're going to make this personal at this point. I can think of one case where the FTC sanctioned an individual CEO, not just their company, but the actual CEO of the company, because they didn't have a cybersecurity program.
Wow.
They just didn't have one. And you have to think, in the year 2023, how did you have a grown-up real company that didn't do that? And this is where we see a regulatory response is going to come up, co-measure it to that.
Yeah, yeah. So how do security leaders tie cyber resilience to the theme of business success? Because the truth is that businesses that offer customers a safe space are the ones that are likely to reap the rewards. And so, Kane, any thoughts on that?
I think the most effective cyber leaders, and CISOs especially, are translating it into a competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. A lot of third-party risk management forms that I see, which are inevitably spreadsheets, are what types of third-party attestation do you have that says you know what you're doing? And they're looking for like a ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 Type 2 management report that shows that your business is trustworthy for our business to do with. And that's really as a result of the increased number of breaches that are happening in partner ecosystems. I read a recent report that said 90% of companies had a partner in the past 2 years who'd sustained a breach. Mm-hmm. I think the other 10% just might not have known about that. Mm-hmm. And that leads to disastrous supply chain consequences. As we've seen in the past 3 years, supply chain is definitely an emerging topic. There's a company in the United Kingdom, they do something with chipsets. They're reporting a $200 million loss this quarter, Q1 of 2023, because one of their upstream suppliers got ransomwared. That is a massive business consequence that's going to affect the employees, it's going to affect their customers, it's going to affect their competitive advantage. I think pivoting that being instead, look, we're doing cybersecurity because we're effectively managing our risk of our company, and it becomes a competitive advantage rather than a cost center, is where security leaders need to lead this conversation.
Yeah. Scott, Tanisha, any thoughts on how you can tie cybersecurity to business success?
I was just thinking from the standpoint of the distraction. When you go through a cyber breach, it is distracting throughout the entire organization. Yeah. But if you're being proactive and you in a sense plan for it, and I always tell companies plan for it. It's not if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. So if you plan for it, you're better prepared. Mm-hmm. You have less downtime, less distractions, less employees leaving, less upset vendors and customers. It makes a huge difference to the bottom line. I think that's what people have to realize. It's part of your business now, cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. So you have to treat it as part of that and spend the right amount of money and provide the right amount of training and awareness within the organization. And then you can be competitive, and then now you can focus on innovation. And that's what everybody wants to do.
Yeah.
And I think that to Kane's point when he was saying that it's just a matter of when now, we need to have as companies the ability to be able to take it a step further and say, hey, are we doing our tabletop exercises? Are we turning these documents into living documents where we're actually living them and we're figuring out exactly what we're going to do? We're going to, basically practice so that in the event of a breach that, we're able to actually know what needs to be done. We know who do we need to call. We know what we need to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that, all of that is a part of business success in terms of making sure that cybersecurity is a part of the overall, I think, business way of life.
Great point. I mean, let me ask you this. I mean, as we think about all of the challenges that may come up as a part of this day to day, how much does this idea of resilience require better transparency from companies and also more willingness to collaborate? Tanisha, can you start with that one? Because it sounds like you were saying, yeah, they need to get some of this work done. They may not necessarily be doing it. They need to admit that they're not doing what they should.
Absolutely. When we're talking about resilience, what we're really talking about is being able to identify that an attack has happened and then also being able to recover. Mm-hmm. So, I mentioned making sure that you're prepared during the tabletop exercising, making sure that all of your plans are not just on paper, but then, they're also ingrained into your security personnel. But, I think that it's also important that we, collaborate and we share information. Scott mentioned, it used to be that when there were breaches that, people would basically hold that information close to the chest because, it affected, the way that a company looked as far as their brand reputation, right? But I think now what we're seeing more is that companies are actually sharing information across verticals. We're seeing that, for example, in the banking sector and the healthcare sectors, companies are talking about, the types of attacks they're seeing, the types of threats that they're seeing. And that information, I think, is being shared more across those lines. And I think that is important because, there's a lot to be learned from, the collective experience across, multiple people who are working across the same, sectors. The other thing that I think is important is, when we're talking about the sharing of information. So we're talking about, across business line, companies actually sharing that information internally as well, making sure that that information is being distributed across the multiple levels so that everybody can, basically play their role within the organization. And then I think also you mentioned in your opening about a closed loop approach. Just making sure that any of these outputs from these things that are happening are actually being used as inputs back into, our processes and procedures that we're actually learning based on these experiences and growing from them. So it's like, fool me once, but, we're feeding that back in there so you won't fool me again. And I think that's important.
And this is such a great point. It's one of the biggest hindrances to innovation, that even though you are doing some of the exercises you're talking about, that learning isn't actually applied to what you do next. And so over time, people might get weary of doing that because they feel like nothing ever changes. Nothing ever.
Right, and it should change. We should be, when we talk about a closed loop, I think that's, it's one of those buzzwords that we're hearing a lot in 2023. We should be doing a postmortem, getting the feedback from that, and then using that feedback to to go back into the loop and to grow from it, update our processes and procedures, and what to look for. If we're not updating those tools, if they're not growing and learning, automation is not going to be the answer that we think it is. So it's important that we, actually update those processes and those signatures, and we grow from these experiences.
Right, so that we can work smarter and not harder.
Absolutely.
Scott, Kane, any thoughts?
I wanted to add, kind of along the same lines. I think when I look back, when our company was compromised and I was transparent and told the story, it was interesting the response I got from the employees. I wasn't sure. Interestingly enough, they appreciated it. And then post-breach, I noticed anytime there was anything suspicious, they would approach me.
Yeah.
They felt part of the company now, and they said, there's truth here. I can be honest. Yeah, I clicked on the wrong link. Something happened, my machine's locked up, what do I do? Thank you for telling me, first of all. You want to work with your team and make sure that they're educated, but that they also can come to you and share their problems and mistakes they made so you don't get in deeper. And that's really the key. I've had so many business owners call me and say, in the middle of the night, Scott, I think we got hit by a ransomware attack. I was like, okay, what did you do? I didn't do anything, I called you. I said, well, okay, let's go down the list and step through some things. And they're like, I don't want to tell anyone about this. I can't admit it, it's embarrassing. I'm like, wait a minute, stop. I said, do you need help or not? You have to go through the proper procedures and let people know. And you have to do this or else it's going to get worse. And a lot of times business owners kind of go, well, maybe I'll do nothing. And I'm like, that's not an answer. You can't put your head in the sand when you have a serious problem. And I think being transparent, whether it's a small business or a large corporation, that's important because, as you mentioned, even about the brand, it affects your brand, especially if you're a public company. You gotta come clean. You look at many of the large brands, and some of them, you found out about it months or a year later that there was a breach.
Or years.
Or years. And some of them were instant. Some of the biggest breaches that come to my mind, that they actually responded quickly and they told you, here's what happens, here's the mistakes we made, here's what we've done, here's the corrective action going forward. You say, you know what? They were transparent, they told everybody, they have a plan in place, this probably won't happen again. But if it does, they're prepared. And that's what all businesses just really want to be prepared.
So I've been taking down some notes as you've been talking. So I see some themes coming out of this, and so feel free to jump in if you think that I've missed something or if you have more to add on any of those. Security helps businesses to push their competitive agendas forward with confidence, correct? Yes? Especially now with so many of us relying on data to innovate and to deliver on our promises to sort of serve the customer with some level of operational excellence, right? Companies need broad ecosystem support in order to focus on this properly. They can't just focus on IT and security doing that alone. Is that fair? Companies really need to learn from their past attacks to prevent future ones. And this closed loop process can help everybody get better at understanding threats and protecting their data. And this is part of doing business now, so companies should be able to identify attacks immediately and then recover from them quickly, and communication is especially important as we try to do that. Did I miss anything? Okay, so let's look a bit at compliance and data protection then. So privacy is a growing concern for lawmakers and citizens, and so how can businesses keep data protected highly available, and be sure that they're complying with all of the current laws and regulations that we find ourselves dealing with. Tanisha, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Absolutely. I think it's important when we're looking at data and privacy protections that we're making sure that we're staying up to date. A lot of companies will rely on information that might be on the internet, for example, or that might be a bit aged, but it's important that you look at all of the different possible regulations that could possibly affect your business, depending on what sector you're in, depending on what state you're in, and then take the least restrictive approach. I think just make sure that you err on the side of caution in trying to figure out whether or not those protections are going to be necessary for your organization.
Mm-hmm. Kane, what about you?
I think that it comes down to a question of how a company is prioritizing its risk, and that can be expressed best at who does the CISO report to. And Gartner recently put out a study that found that most CISOs who do not report directly to the CEO will build their security program around compliance. And as Scott said, we've seen checkbox compliance, and we've seen how that actually isn't security. And so if a company has misaligned risk to say, well, cybersecurity belongs with the CIO because, I don't know, computers, they're going to have a bad time every time.
Yeah.
Companies really need to have a mature conversation that cyber risk is business risk 100% of the time, and then plan to staff their programs appropriately and build their security controls appropriately around that so that it's a mature business level conversation, not just something about computers and technology, because we are way past that point. And today's regulatory landscape is showing that the enforcement agencies, like it used to be the FTC and the SEC, they were okay with sanctioning you. Now they will go hard, and it will not go easy, especially if a company has materially understated an event that occurred, or alternatively, if they're just like out and out trying to hide something, that tends to go extremely poorly.
Yeah.
And I think we also have like a lot more regulations that are going in place today than we had before, which dictate, how fast you're supposed to actually identify people or notify people in the case of an issue. And I think that that's important because, before, you would see companies that are like waiting until they have a good handle, or, they may try to delay it or try to, see how bad it is. And I think that, these regulations that say, hey, you've got 60 days to make notifications, or 30 days or whatever it is, I think that they're important in making sure that the information gets out there so that it's not continued. Because if you look at some of the more high profile attacks that have happened, especially ones that, have affected like a lot of people, I'm thinking about like maybe Equifax, for example, those breaches, happened over the course of, a very long period of time, right? So, at that point in time, that information was out there and was available, and nobody, was none the wiser. So, I think that, when we're starting to see some of these regulations that say that 30 days, 60 days, whatever that number is, that, that's going to help to make people a little bit more safer because they're going to be aware about what's going on.
So let me ask you this. Are we sometimes seeing in business that there can be this conflict between auditors and security teams, and that having conflict like that stymies really robust data protection? Kane, is this something that you've seen?
I frequently see an us versus them mentality between the security team and the compliance team. And the security team is charged with securing the business, and their annual performance review form is going to say, did you secure the business? And the compliance team is, did you keep us compliant? The compliance team is very often dependent upon the security team for evidence that they are secure and that the controls are operational, but nowhere on the security team's annual performance review form does it say they were nice to the compliance team. And often what happens is the perception that the security team has that the compliance team keeps nagging them. They keep asking them. It's draining. They're asking for another screenshot, another Excel spreadsheet. They're especially in heavily regulated industries where you've got multiple lines of business that are covered by various regulatory things, especially in finance where you've got the SEC, you've got New York Section 500, you've got GLBA, I could go on, but you get the general gist of it, where there's just this increased scrutiny. And security teams, they don't like it. They don't, if you're a technical person who got into the computer security industry because it's fun and it's interesting and it's rewarding, having to be compliant feels like a nuisance, and that comes out emotionally. And where that causes trouble then is a company has an obligation, a burden to be compliant. They have to report on that. I think that we have to look at ways that we can reduce that organizational friction, and that can happen both at the team-to-team interaction. I think later we'll talk about automation and how some of that can happen, but also at the board level and at the executive level, where if the CEO has a working relationship with the CISO, not just with the board, but they have to have this be about business level risk so that everyone's rowing the boat in the same direction. I think in heavily regulated industries, this is a muscle memory they've developed, not out of choice, but in many cases out of necessity. In less regulated industries, it's going to be a learning experience for them.
So let me ask you about these industries. Where are you seeing this balancing act show up as a problem in specific industries? Any ideas?
I think one of the ones that comes to mind is construction. And construction is not a heavily regulated industry like finance or like healthcare. In construction, it's not about security, it's about safety. And unlocking that conversation made it become about, let's talk about employee safety, because that's a cultural artifact. I think that in healthcare, it's an understood thing that we're dealing with patient data, and in finance, it's understood that we're dealing with financial data, and the cyber criminals rob those institutions because they have money. But then if you go out to something that's aligned but not directly, like let's go with biotech, right, where they're developing genomic solutions. Not as heavily regulated except for by the FDA. They're struggling to find that right balance between security and compliance because they don't have all the compliance controls baked in yet. So they're looking for what are those best practices that they can adopt that will make security a competitive advantage without being a massive resource drain or make it an encumbrance for one to do their job.
Interesting.
And I was going to say, I think when we're talking about best practices, one of the things I think I see doing that's done well in the energy sector is that safety is a company priority, right? So even if you're in IT or even if you're in, you're a help desk, whatever the case may be, the overall safety numbers for the company are a part of the performance evaluations for the entire org structure, right? So, I don't think that we see that as much in healthcare companies and, for example, in the financial sector, right? I think that it's important when we're talking about, this is in the performance evaluations for, for example, the compliance people, but not the healthcare, or the compliance people, but not the actual security people. That is important that it be across the board, right? And I think that to your book's title, that it's everybody's business, that it should be an evaluation metric across the board, right? Not just for the people who are actually on the front lines or doing the day-to-day, but I think down to even the janitors or the whoever's in the business. I think it's a part of the organizational culture that security should be something that's everybody is required to maintain.
Yeah, I agree. Scott, anything?
And I think building upon her point, when it becomes a cultural, within an organization and the teams work together, there are some great success stories. I think about in the financial sector, one of the largest financial hacks that happened a number of years ago with this breach. How did they respond to it? Well, they responded immediately. Yeah. They told the shareholders, the public, what happened, what went wrong, what they're going to do. They committed over $500 million toward future cybersecurity upgrades so it doesn't happen again. So when it's clear leadership that takes command and explains it to everybody out there, and everybody in the organization works together as a team, they can do well. That company's doing very well now. They grew rapidly after that, despite the fact that they had a major data breach in one of the largest financial companies. So it's all in how you handle and respond to the crisis at hand.
Great point. Automation and security is really a big talking point right now, but I think it's vital that we understand what that means. So Scott, let me ask you, how can businesses leverage automation to deal with some of the threats that they're seeing?
Well, I think it's having that right balance. Use automation for where it can be effective. In other words, for the repetitive, mundane tasks that humans honestly aren't that good with. We make mistakes, we get bored, and that's a perfect scenario for automation in cyber. Take care of those mundane, repetitive problems. And you could use different types of technology along with that, anomaly detection. Maybe something like you see, I don't know, something's logging into the bank credentials 10 times in a row. Well, that's not normal.
Yeah.
That's mundane for a person to see that and observe it. It's not going to happen, but a computer can do that.
Yeah.
And raise a red flag, and now you can go investigate it and make a difference. So I think using automation in the right area will actually make a huge difference. And now it allows you to really concentrate the human factor, which is the important factor,
Yeah.
hopefully the people. We can now focus on the business at hand and being productive and being innovative, but yet we still want to keep that human factor into it. The human, I think, is really helping automate the process.
Yeah.
They look at it and they give the real input, so automation can be corrected. It's almost like the argument of artificial intelligence. If you don't have a human behind it,
Yeah.
it's not very intelligent.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing applies with automation in the world of cyber. Having humans behind it, taking real world data, big data that they have a ton of, analyze it and now feed that so certain tasks can be properly automated. And then you could solve a lot of the cybersecurity problems. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But never keep the human factor out of it. I think that's key.
Yeah, I like the phrase that's come out in research called human plus machines, instead of humans instead of machines, right? Kane, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I think that Scott's right in that a lot of the mundane and boring stuff needs to be automated, and that is the security controls. We should be able, like, we're at a point that we should be able to automate that stuff and just check, see, is this working? Is it doing anything unusual? Similarly, at a management level, we should be able to go, hey, is this compliant? Or is the vulnerability scanner running? Is the patching running as expected? And then catch those anomalies that happen. Beyond that, though, then, that gives people the time to be creative. I think that threat hunting as a discipline is something that most businesses should be leaning into at this point, where if you've automated most of the things that are going to be, your average bad stuff on the internet, go look for the other stuff that you're otherwise missing, and your staff will appreciate that. Yeah. Or your compliance team, like, what else could they be, instead of asking for yet another PDF of the same document, can they look at it and say, what else could we be doing to, like, increase our competitive advantage? Because what we've seen is, as companies can move away from that rote things, they can actually make security a competitive advantage to against their market, where it's no longer a cost center. Yeah. Because nobody wants to work in an industry where the best thing that happened that day is nothing bad happened.
Absolutely.
Security is there to enable the business. It's not there to be a cost drain.
Right.
I was just going to say, also, if you look at penetration testing from a discipline, right? You start off with the vulnerability scanners, you start off with the automated tools, right? But that's not the end of it, right? Because if that was the end of it, then, there wouldn't be a need for pen testers, right? I mean, I think the ability to be able to take those results and then be able to dive deeper to actually take a look and see, what vulnerabilities there. I think that making sure that you have that human piece is essential. I think not just in the offensive space, but also in the defensive space as well. So, I think to your point of, hey, it's the human factor is important. It's important that we have these automated tools. It's important that we are, updating them. We talked about the closed loop. It's important that we are updating our signatures or updating our automated systems, but at the same time, there needs to be a human that is involved in this process to be able to, take it deeper, to be able to look take a deeper look, and then in some cases, be able to see whether or not proof of concept needs to be developed, or I think that the human plus person, the human plus automated system is very important.
We talk about how technology aids automation of tasks, but can it also support more widely to protect and recover data? Because we had this conversation about this idea of human plus machine work. How does getting all of this together in one consolidated way help the way that leaders work every day? Tanisha, I'll start with you.
So I think that when we're in the middle of an attack, we're actually going to have input sources from a lot of different systems that are basically being put forward. So I think in this case, a single dashboard, which basically serves as a point of reference for all of these different sources of information, will help us to be able to correlate and be able to see all of the indicators of compromise, right? And I think that having that in one place when we're talking about the human plus automation piece is important, because then we can actually be able to get the information from the various sources to be able to, use that as an input to make sure that we have the evidence of the attack.
Such a great point, right? Because you're right, when you're under attack, you're grasping for straws, you're looking under every single rock, trying to figure out what's going on. So sort of thinking about that in advance and knowing ahead of time what you want to see, what information is important, I would imagine would be valuable.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that security leaders that are enabled with a risk dashboard that shows them the live status of what risks they're facing so that they can make appropriate staffing and resource allocation decisions is really necessary, because in today's macroeconomic climate, we don't have unlimited resources, we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited people, and so we have to choose how we're going to respond. Being able to do that proactively by getting a live sense of how effective are our controls right now at burning down our risks, how effectively are we communicating that internally, will really direct and sometimes deflect and prevent, or at least constrain any events that occur before they turn into a full-blown incident. Whereas looking hindsight, that's probably the sorts of things that Tanisha was saying, that that's the kind of thing you want to have. You want to have a dashboard that shows in the middle of attack what's going on, but it's better if you can understand where the most likely attack vectors will be proactively so you can staff for them.
Yeah. And I would imagine, Scott, getting away from this hair on fire mentality of looking at every single source and every single place can make you a lot more effective in the middle of the crisis, as well as preparing for it ahead of time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it allows you that the aggregation of all of that in one central dashboard allows you to respond much quicker. And you can do other things with that data. For example, say you wanted to generate some reports. Now you have something tangible that's useful that you could share throughout your organization so they could look forward to seeing that in the future and take response immediately to something like that. So it is kind of training and proactive response when you're able to get something out of that data, when it's all down to a single dashboard and give you instant alerts.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about having an indicator, developing our signatures off of those indicators, so we can know what happened beforehand, so that we can kind of use that as a predictor, to be able to alert on. I think that that's in the theme of feedback loop. It's important to making sure that we're able to detect this the next time that it happens.
Yeah, this goes to that insight we talked about, right? So that you actually can add these disparate pieces of information together to create new value and not just be focusing on what's happened to you right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds like all of you are saying then that there's this idea that even though we're doing automation, there still will be this human factor, right? We're not going to necessarily get rid of people, but automating a lot of this can free up resources considerably so that people can focus on strategy and innovation. And so I like to tell people this in class. One of the things research says is that insight happens when you can combine two or more pieces of information together in a unique way to create new value. And if you're not spending your time on those mundane things, you actually have more time for insight to create competitive advantage for your organization. And I fully agree with you. This is a place where you can actually use security as a lever to be more competitive, as opposed to something that you're doing just to protect yourself from a level of risk. So in the short term, businesses will be looking to leverage data in a lot of different ways, right? As well as possibly using more cloud technology to manage that data. As they try to do that strategically, what do you think these security leaders should be thinking about and the organization should be thinking about so that they don't increase their risk of attack on that path?
Cool.
Scott.
One thought I had is important, regardless of where you put your data, on your network, the cloud, on-premise, off-premise, whatever, you got to know where your data is. And it's interesting, a lot of companies I talk to, they have no clue. And you ask them, they say, I don't know, I used the XYZ company, they take care of it. Well, that's not good, because they probably have the data residing somewhere. Usually there's a backup residing somewhere else. What country is it in? No idea. Where are the servers? No idea. Is it encrypted? No idea. It's important for the company to understand, because data is everything now. And really that's the product of most companies now. And if you don't have control of that data and have it properly protected, you're not doing your job. So I think just fundamentally understanding before you choose where you want to have that data housed is a very important question that people need to ask within an organization.
Such a great point. I mean, we've heard people for years talk about disruption occurring in so many different areas, and now we're seeing disruption occurring with data, and so it is becoming a core part of people's value that they can add in terms of how they think about new products and services to offer. Kane, what about you?
I think that Scott's right. Companies don't know where their data are, and also they often can't articulate what the critical bits are. And that is very unique to a business, not just to an industry, but to a business. And so I really encourage companies to look at identifying their crown jewels or their trade secrets or their single most important piece of data that they have, not just focusing on, well, what's the thing that we're going to get hit with from a regulatory fine on. A good example is in manufacturing, right? You might think, well, our intellectual property for the thing that we manufacture, that's the top. No, it's not. It's probably not. You might feel that it is. It's probably the way that you did it.
Yeah.
It's your manufacturing process, because it's cheaper to steal a process than it is to steal a plan, because then you can build other stuff out of it. And I found that in those conversations with companies around identifying what their critical assets are, that it again becomes a business level risk. What if we lose this? Like, let's take regulatory compliance out, just set that by aside. What's the thing that's going to be deleterious to our business, to our reputation, to our supply chain? Have that conversation before you have the conversation about the cybers, because this is not a technology conversation. In some businesses, construction, stuff gets laid out on tables. Right? And if you're working with the federal government, if you're a defense contractor and you're leaving papers out on tables, you are going to have a hard time, because they don't like that, to put it mildly. So again, focus on what the critical part of the business is, rather than focusing on, well, here's this data. No. Let's take it to a higher level and then go identify those assets. And then apply controls so that nice people like Tanisha can't do terrible things to those assets, which I bet you can do all day long.
What do you think they should focus on to sort of...
I was actually going to say, I was at an event last week at the White House where they were talking about the cyber strategy, and I heard former Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms speak about this cyber attack that they had in the city of Atlanta. And I think that the most important takeaway for me from that conversation was when she said that the first thing that they had to figure out is actually where the data was actually being held, right? And I think that, when we're talking about, organizations and companies that are, understanding like their asset inventory, right? A lot of the bigger companies, I think, pretty much have that information understood. It's common knowledge, or at least it should be, right? But when we're looking at some of the small and medium business, we're looking at like local state governments, when we're looking at, some of the smaller companies, right? That is I think the first question that should be answered when we're talking about security. And I think a lot of people take that for granted. They'll say, oh, it's hosted in the cloud, or, oh, it's held here, with not really a great understanding of exactly where that is, right? Going back to the conversation about the data protections and privacy, right? You have to know exactly where your data is so that you can know what regulatory requirements are for that data, where it's held. If it's held in Europe versus the United States, for example, right? So, I think that all of these, pieces tie together very, very closely in having a holistic view of what your security actually is.
Yeah, such a great point. I mean, as I think about all of the things we've talked about so far, it seems overwhelming, right? There's a lot of things that people have to consider. Do you ever feel like there's so much happening now that people have to grapple with that they're not ready for what's happening today, much less thinking about what they should be looking at for the next 5 years? Because sometimes when I hear people talk about this growing complexity of data and all of that, it just seems like a lot for them to sort of take in and to manage.
I think, at least looking at it again from maybe a business owner's perspective, you can only deal with so much in a day. So I think if you focus on what's in front of you here and now and do your best job protecting that, encrypting, doing whatever you have to keep that data safe, to keep your company running, is important. If you think ahead too far, 3 years, 5 years, it's good to think ahead. But it's really hard to also plan to be doing something in 5 years, because technology is changing so fast. So you almost unthink the solution, and you kind of do nothing then. So it's better really focus on, okay, as what he was saying before, here's my organization, what am I trying to protect? Is it intellectual property? What's my value, my secret sauce? Focus on the best way to do that. If you can't do it, it's okay to get help from outside. And I think that's an important part. Get a third party in there, somebody objective. And I had a kind of like a moment where I was woken up after our company was compromised and hacked, and we had somebody come in and do a penetration test and vulnerability assessment. I was smiling thinking, this will go great because now we know what we're doing. Guess what? They opened our eyes as a cybersecurity company to so many things that we were still vulnerable to.
So you still couldn't sleep at night?
Yeah, I still couldn't sleep at night. But that's really important, though. In other words, it's an ongoing process. So think for the moment. Think, what are we going to do this year to keep everything as safe as we reasonably can? Yeah. You'll never stop everything 100%. I think that's an important point to be made as well. Yeah. A lot of people think, well, there's the silver bullet, I'll do this, and I'm done. Now I can go back to business. It's not that. It's a part of your business process. Yeah. Got to do that. And if it's not weaved in there, it won't happen.
Yeah.
And I think also a lot of the things that we're seeing happening today have been things that the security professionals have been saying probably for the past 5-10 years, right? So, it seems overwhelming today, but if you just look back and you at your security professionals, we've been saying, hey, this is a problem, right? Especially, when we look at things like some of the critical infrastructure attacks that we've been seeing, ransomware attacks. We've been within the security profession been saying for years, hey, we need to take a closer look at our security infrastructure. We need to take a closer look at these things. And I think that, the lack of preparation is kind of displayed, in the being overwhelmed itself, right? Because again, if you're preparing for these things, if you're saying, hey, what are the possible threats that are possible, you're keeping that information up to date, then I think then you're well prepared for some of these and then you're less overwhelmed, right? The people who feel like all of these things are happening right now, it's all like so much, it's just, a right now problem. I think that they don't realize that in the security industry, we've been saying that these things were possible. We've been, imagining the worst case scenario, for a while. So not to be like a negative Nancy, but, that's our job is to figure out, what could possibly happen. As a pen tester, I know I'm always looking at things like, what did they not think about? What did they not expect to happen? What's outside the realm of normal? And I think that, when we were talking about the diversity piece, right, having people who have the ability to be able to think outside of the box, outside of how things are imagined is important, especially if we're going to stay ahead of the adversaries.
Yeah. It's really important, not just in terms of how we look, but where we come from, right? Because these different paths in life cause us to see things differently. We see opportunities differently. We see threats differently. And so that's all important. Let me summarize where we've gone so far. So what I hear you saying is that sort of fighting these cyber attacks and assuring that we have business continuity is a team sport, right? And it sounds like you're saying that involvement from the board down is required and that you can't just rely on one department. Also, that growing regulatory demands mean that if you do just throw this over to IT and security and you don't get to the right levels of commitment, both with resources and funding, then everybody's going to suffer. It also sounds like you believe that technology can help with lots of different functions like monitoring backups and managing business critical applications, and that by using technology for that purpose, then leaders will have time to work on other initiatives that help make the company more competitive. So as we come to the end of a great conversation, thank you all, by the way, I wonder if each one of you has some final thoughts. So what key point on cyber resilience would you want to finish on? And Tanisha, I'll start with you first.
Get your pen test done. Make sure that you're aware of the possible threats that are out there, and I think stay prepared. Know what the risks are, and tabletop those and make a plan.
Scott, what about you?
Well, I think I reflect back on all the stuff that I dealt with when my company was compromised and I was educating people, and everybody looked at me a deer in the headlight. What are you talking about? After a few years, then I realized cybersecurity is now everybody's business. And that was my second book title, because I saw everybody I talked to, they were talking about cybersecurity. It affected everybody. So I encourage everybody within a company's organization, don't just look at departments whose job it is. I always say from the janitor to the CEO. So everybody within the organization needs to have some cybersecurity best practices, some knowledge in place, and it's ongoing. Training and awareness needs to happen throughout the process. Because if you look at the statistics where we are, it does look grim. If you look at ransomware, 2018, it was about $4,000, the average payout. If you look at ransomware, last year it was over $400,000, the average payout. Where we are today, it's I think about every 11 seconds a ransomware attack reported. We extrapolate that out to 2031. It's every 2 seconds, according to Cybersecurity Ventures. So it's telling us it's actually getting worse logarithmically. So the more we do right here and right now, make it our business, the more difference we could make.
Yeah, great point. Kane, bring us home.
I think that the point I'll make is that cyber risk is ultimately business risk, and companies need to recognize that early. We're seeing the SEC force that now, where under their proposed guidance for publicly traded companies, the CISO is going to have to talk to the board. And under GLBA, there's going to have to be somebody in charge of security. If we want to get ahead of this and not have additional regulatory controls and burdens enforced on our businesses, make security about risk, make it about the business. I think all CISOs have got a fiduciary duty to have a conversation with the CEO every maybe 15 minutes, have a coffee, talk about how it's going. Don't make it about the technology. We have moved past that point in the world. Security effectively done can be a competitive advantage for a lot of businesses, and it isn't just something you have to do because you're regulated into it or legaled into it. It actually can be an effective business driver.
Well said. I'll leave it at that. Well, I think that was a great discussion where we have really explored the all too often overlooked emotional cost of dealing with cyber attacks. But we also talked about how security is a key driver of business success, and it must be framed as such. I would like to thank Tanisha, Scott, and Kane for their insights. I'm Pamela Rucker. Thank you for watching.